Well, hello to everyone. I'm with a very good friend of mine today, even though we're in totally different time zones. I'm still trying to wake up, and he's been at it for a while. I'm with the one and only James Tripp. James is, in my opinion, one of the top personal development coaches and trainers in the world. He has an incredible background of study in many different areas. A lot of people know him from his work in the hypnosis without trance, but he's got a lot more going on than that. He's in the UK, and I've just been blessed to get to know him, and we've struck up a really good friendship. And anytime I feel like I need a like-minded or person or someone who just sees things totally different, James is one of the guys that I try to chat with and connect. So, James, thanks for talking with me today.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you for that glorious introduction. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Appreciate
Well,
that.
I wanted to talk a little bit today about something that I think we're both headed in this direction, and you definitely are. The idea of a non-linear creation dynamics, and that for a lot of people that's a mouthful, but to me, this is a totally different way of seeing how to create our lives, how to create our relationships, our businesses. Could you talk a little bit about how you're kind of coming around to this and what, from your perspective, is a nonlinear creation dynamic?
Yeah, sure. You're absolutely right. It is a mouthful, and given what I do and the sort of stuff that I share and the sort of stuff that I teach, I hire coaches for myself, and I have a marketing coach I had. He said, "You don't want to use that term, non-linear creation dynamics. That's a terrible term from a marketing perspective." And I said, "Yeah, you're absolutely right, but it's." Once people sort of get into it and think, well, what is this saying? Right. It's the best description I can come up with for what it is that I'm looking to shine a light on here. So I'm going to unpack that a little bit, the non-linear creation dynamics, the bits inside of it. So non-linear, this first bit. In fact, let's go the other way, creation dynamics. Okay. In my view, we as human beings are constantly creating through our interactions with the world. We are creating various outcomes. We are bringing our adaptive intelligence to different moments. And sometimes we're bringing the patterns that our adaptive intelligence has already created to particular moments. But we're looking to make things happen. We are looking to make differences in the world, small and large, whether it be from, we were talking about shifting global consciousness at the top end to making a cup of coffee at the bottom end. We're looking to make differences. Now, there's a couple of ways you can look at making differences. You can take the productivity paradigm. Now, for me, the productivity paradigm is, and this is very linear, so I talked about non-linear in this as well. The linear productivity paradigm is, in order to get something to happen, I have to follow a series of steps to make that thing happen. And this is a set of causes to bring about an effect. And I want to map those out, and I know what they are. And this is a very common way of thinking in the Western world. And I think it's inculcated into us in our school system. There's this idea, right? You have to study this curriculum in this order, and then you take these exams, and then you pass the exams, you get these qualifications, and then you can use those qualifications to go on and do something else. And, and then it gets carried over into the world of work. It's nice and it's organized and it's linear. I used to work in project management, and it was all about Gantt charts and figuring out, who was going to do what and when, and getting this whole thing mapped, this perfect plan. Now, of course, reality, the thing about projects and project management is, anyone that works in project management will know that it's extremely rare that projects come in on time and on budget. Extremely rare. And certainly all of the stuff that people work out ahead of time, it doesn't necessarily unfold that way. Not to say that those plans can't be useful, they can. There's a phrase from the UK Special Boat Services, and a little aphorism, which is, nothing ever works without a plan, but no plan ever works. And I think Mike Tyson had a similar one, which is, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face.
Yeah.
So this idea of, right, we've got to do these things in this particular order. It's like treating everything like a machine. We've got to set up these moving parts and make sure the machine runs smooth and it's going to produce this outcome. Now, I'm not saying that this doesn't work as a way of making difference in the world, because it does. A lot of people can be very productive like that, but they're rarely creative, because creativity doesn't work in the same way. Creativity isn't about deciding exactly ahead of time how something is going to be and making it come together that way. Creativity comes out of a dance, out of an interaction. So I've sort of lived in two worlds in some ways. I've been a project manager, and I want to say I wasn't good at that. It was not good for my temperament and my general way of doing things. But I also was very much, when I was in my teens and 20s, I was very much into music. And I didn't write music, but I would create music. So I had a studio and I would record music. Now that process, the creative process for me, it wasn't, and I think you'll find this with most creative people. If you say, do you have an absolutely clear vision in your mind before you start, that you then realize, and the end product is a realization of that clear vision you had at the front end. I've never met anyone that says, yes, that's exactly how I do it. Yeah. Right? I project what was in my mind onto the world and it comes about somehow. What was true for me, and I think is true for most creative people, is there'll be some sense of direction, some sort of intentionality, often an inspiration. So when I was making music, creating pieces of music, I'd often hear something else and I go, yeah, I like that. I really like the feel of that, the vibe of that. Yeah, I'd like to create something like that that had a similar feel or a similar vibe. But that would be it. It would be something about the feel, the vibe. And then I would get an instrument, which might be my guitar, or maybe I'd go straight to the keyboard or something like that. And I would start to play around with something. Play around with an idea, and something might pop up and I go, ooh. And then that would suggest to me something else. So I might just lay that down quickly and think, okay, I want a beat underneath of that. And then I grab the drum machine and I start working a beat under it. You know, so, and it would be like each piece would inform the next piece.
Right. Yeah.
And the vision would be there, or the idea or the sense would be there in the mix. And often it would change and change shape because something better would suggest itself. Something more exciting, something more novel and interesting. So there's an interplay of different elements coming in from different places. I remember one piece of music that I wrote, which I still particularly like to this day. I keep thinking of getting back into music and maybe re-recording some of the old stuff, but maybe I just end up creating new stuff. But it was based off, I was in Florence in Italy, and the ambulances had a particularly interesting siren. So this siren went dee-dee-dee-dee, dee-dee-dee-dee, dee-dee-dee-dee. And I was thinking, it's kind of interesting. It's a bit repetitive, but it's a bit more interesting than our ambulance sirens. Mm-hmm. So it was going around in my head. And when I got back home, I started playing around on the keyboard with this dee-dee-dee-dee. And I got this sort of brass sound on the keyboard. And after a few minutes, it had turned into a lick that went, and it's kind of a bit Arabic and a bit, I have no idea how it got from there to there, but it did through playful exploration. So this is generally how creation works. Creation is not a linear process. It's a dance. It's about being open to what comes through and what that suggests, and being willing to go with that, even if it means switching tack a little bit, rather than going, no, I decided I was going to do something like this, so that's what I'm going to do. Mm-hmm. Now, so yeah, I'd say that's the contrast. Productivity is linear, creativity is non-linear. Now, a lot of people go, well, I want to be creative over here, so I'm going to have a little studio, I'm going to paint, or maybe I'm going to make some music. But of course, then when I get down to the serious business of life, I need to get really clear on what I'm going to do. I'm going to figure out the steps, and I'm going to push on and push through and get these things happening, because that's how you make stuff happen in life. This is what I learned at school. It's how you really make things happen. Now, I've spent years toggling in and out of these different paradigms. When I did my hypnosis without trance stuff, which was wildly successful over 10 years ago, 2009, that thing that I put out, hypnosis without trance, where did it come from? Did I sit down and go, right, I need to have a successful thing that I put out into the world. I'm going to come up with this thing. It didn't come about like that at all. It was an approach to hypnosis. Somebody else suggested that I ought to teach it because they thought it was novel and different. And I'm just going, is it? Okay, that's great. But it came about from a series of chance events and me playing with some different ideas and looking at how something from over there fitted with this. You know, I ended up I was an NLP coach. I ended up switching to being a hypnotherapist for purely commercial reasons, because people would Google hypnotherapy in the crude version of Google back at the time, or maybe it was even Yahoo or something people were mostly using back then. I don't know, but they would search for hypnotherapy. They wouldn't search for NLP coach. So I became a hypnotherapist. You know, I had some Ericksonian stuff in the background because that was part of the training that I did with NLP. Very lightweight Ericksonian stuff, but a little bit Ericksonian anyway. So I could do some trancey stuff and I could do my NLP, but I thought, well, being as I'm now a hypnotherapist, a hypnotist officially, I ought to find out a bit more about hypnosis and different approaches. And just through sort of organizing some practice groups, meeting people, making contacts, I ended up hanging around with street hypnotists in London who were an interesting bunch. And so they're interested in what they were doing, but I didn't like what they were doing either. It wasn't the right flavor for me. So I'm thinking, oh, can I do what they do, but in a more conversational kind of way, in a more uptime, eyes open, interactive kind of way. And that's what I ended up doing. And I ended up selling this program called the Hypnosis Mastery Program. It sold phenomenally well. I couldn't believe that it was selling so well. I'm thinking, this is great. And then my brain sort of started to ruin it for me. I got this piece of advice from a business guru who said, be smart enough to know when you're getting lucky. And I thought, oh, that sounds brilliant and wise. It ended up enslaving me for years because I thought, right, I've got to take this seriously because this is really working now. So I got to take it seriously. And I remember the moment this happened. I was filling up my car with fuel, and my PayPal had been going off all day, and I was making money and thinking, this is crazy. I'm making money and I'm not working, and it feels weird. Money's coming in, I'm not working. This feels weird. And I had this sort of sense of unreality because this isn't the way the world works. I need to be grinding to make money. This isn't the way the world works. And so I sort of started taking it more seriously and working much harder, because I'd created this whole hypnosis without trance thing through play, through just interactive play and exploration, taking it very lightly. Now I'm taking it seriously. As soon as I took it seriously, my income started to go down. So I started to think, I thought, right, that was working. I'm going to take this more lightly again and just be playful and relaxed. My income went up. And then my brain kicked in and said, no, now you've got to take it seriously because things are working. And I went on this roller coaster of income going up and down. The more loosely I held things, the more creatively I engaged, the more lightly I engaged, the more money I made, the more my old schooling, my project management hat, all of this. And the more I listened to the business gurus who would say, well, here's how you construct your funnel. And I'm not saying there's no value in that stuff, but held too tightly, it doesn't do good things for my energy or my creativity. So I'm very, very curious about this way of holding outcomes more loosely as just part in a bigger conversation, so to speak, informing. I sometimes use the phrase dancing results out of reality. And living in the world in a way that is creative and literally seeing everything as part of the creative medium in which you are working, all of life, everything that comes your way, seeing it as part of that creative medium and going, How can I create with this? How can I connect this to this? How does this connect to that? So there's a lot about connections, a lot about non-linearity, and a lot about emergence, because the results that emerge, this is the point about music as well. Whatever piece of music emerged at the end of the process, it wasn't a thing that I had planned up front. I just engaged in a process and a result emerged. A satisfying result much of the time. If it wasn't satisfying, I'd probably abandon it early on and go off on a different tangent. So that's the kind of, I'd say that's the sort of dry end of it, because I've sort of described that in a reasonably left hemisphere way. And the experience of it, I think, is more important. The phenomenology of it and the magic of it, I think, is more important. Engaging with a certain way of being in the world from the inside out. I think that's an important thing, rather than just, well, you know, you do it like this instead of like that. It's more about a being than a doing, a way of, a place to come from and a way to engage. But we can get into that, because I've just been on a monologue probably for 15 minutes now.
Absolutely great stuff. Yes, please, please. You know, as you were saying that, I was thinking, one of my heroes, Alejandro Jodorowsky, talks about making your life one big kind of magical act, or a series of that. And in a way, changing the terminology, that's kind of what, I don't know, you tell me, that kind of sounds like where that's headed.
Right. So it's interesting you mentioned Jodorowsky. I found his way of being in the world to be quite informative, maybe even inspirational in a great many ways. I love his living of magic. I'm very fascinated by anybody who lives magic and makes it work. I know a couple of people personally, a handful of people personally, who really live magic and make it work. And each one of those, they're not usually sort of followers of particular magical traditions. They just live magically. They have their own ideas about what it is, and they have certain ways of engaging with the world.
Right. And
I think that's a really, really important thing, because for me, speaking personally, that toggling back into doing things in a linear way, that was a really hard habit to break. And it was hard for me to break permanently until I started to shift my paradigms about life and open up to possibilities that sat outside of the materialist and reductionist sort of view of life, a more magical way of being. Now, one of the big shifts for me on this was finally, this is only like maybe a couple of years ago now, maybe even only 18 months ago, but this was a huge game changer for me. There were other things going on at this time as well, but I finally, having had the book for nearly a decade, I read Ian McGilchrist's The Master and His Emissary. And I've recommended this to many people, and some people have cursed me for recommending it to them, because it's a brick of a book. Now, The Master and His Emissary, I'm not going to get too much into it, but it's about hemispheric difference and how different hemispheres do the world differently. Now, there's old sort of ideas about the right hemisphere is creative and the left hemisphere is this. It's less simple. It's not saying this hemisphere does this and that hemisphere does that. It's this hemisphere approaches the world in this way. This hemisphere approaches the world in this way. One of the hemispheres, the left hemisphere, is very linear. It likes to know what's going to happen in what order. It likes things to be black and white. It likes to be able to step back from things and consider them, and be very outcome focused. It's interesting that the left hemisphere, generally for most people, are wired up, runs the right-hand side of the body, and the grasping hand, the hand that does most of the conscious doing, is on that side. The right hemisphere, on the other hand, instead of kind of stepping back from the world and looking at it and trying to map it in these simplistic ways, is immersive. It does more sort of participatory consciousness. And it tends to live in embodied seas of meanings. Now, The other thing about McGilchrist's book, there's a whole bunch of stuff here that ties in with other stuff like Owen Barfield's ideas about the evolution of consciousness and these kinds of things, but I'm not going to go too far down that rabbit hole, not at the moment anyway. But the thing that this book did for me, McGilchrist's book did for me, is it really shook loose my faith in my sort of left hemisphere, tight grip, linear, go for the result kind of thinking. And it really shook, it had me realize how much stuff that I was certain about, because the left hemisphere confabulates, it makes stuff up because it has to get a grip on reality. So as it gets a grip on reality, it makes something up with absolute certainty. Well, this is the way this is, and that's the way that is, and obviously that's possible, and obviously that's not possible. Mm-hmm. And I came to recognize through this, I came to be able to observe my left hemisphere at work and how tightly it gripped the world and how certain it was about so many things that I realized when I really questioned it, have no evidence for. I have no evidence for. I watched Dr. Peter Doshi, doing a little bit to the US Senate, I think, a little 5-minute talk. And Peter Doshi is the chief editor of the British Medical Journal. His talk was on problems in science at the moment, because he teaches people to critically evaluate. He's a professor and he teaches classes on the critical evaluation of research papers. And he said there's a problem sweeping the world of science at the moment. It's the problem of everybody knows that. Everybody knows that X, everybody knows that Y, everybody knows that, everyone knows that that's possible and that's not. Everybody knows that. And he points out that this is actually a very anti-scientific thing. It's a sort of dogma finding its way into science. But this everybody knows that. It's quite a sort of left hemisphere-y thing. It's like, well, everybody knows that, everybody knows there's no such thing as magic. Everybody knows that, right? This is true and that's not true. Well, hang on a second. That's just living in the land of the fudge factor. It's how do we know? And I used to be afraid of being a credulous fool and believing all sorts of stuff. I'm not saying I believe anything now. I have no clue about things. I know I'm less certain about anything than I've ever been before, but I'm much more open to possibility. When my old left hemisphere thinking used to think, well, you either stay grounded in this solid, everybody knows that reality, or you believe foolish things, because the left hemisphere has to do, well, you believe this or this, it's this or this, it's nice and binary. Well, I've sort of found my way into a world of, I have no clue, but I'm open to possibility. So that was shift number one from the hemispheric perspective. Shift number two happened partly as a result of reading some of Owen Barfield's work. I can talk about Owen Barfield in a minute. I think you're familiar with some of Barfield's stuff. I recognized that for a long time, and this is partly the influence of general semantics, and this is a really useful thing to do. I sort of lived in this operationalist view of the world rather than an essentialist view of the world. Now, to highlight that distinction for people, essentialism is kind of like this idea that everything has an essence to it. That is essentially sublime, that is essentially good, that is essentially bad, that is whatever. Operationalism is an approach where you say, well, that isn't essentially good. I perform an operation that makes an evaluation and places good into it. So if I say, this is a great cup of coffee, which I'm normally drinking when I'm on these sorts of things, but I spilled it before coming on. If I said this is a great cup of coffee, I'm performing the operation of evaluating it as great and placing the essence into it. Whereas essentialism would say, no, this is great. Greatness is in this coffee. Now, there's a lot of value in living in an operationalist way. So a lot of this comes from general semantics, because you don't get had by stuff. You have a lot more maneuverability in relation to something. So you develop flexibility, you develop maneuverability. But there's a cost to it as well. And I never realized this for a long time. So I was a very operationalist person. I'm saying there's no meaning in the world. This is my mantra. No meaning in the world. We place it into the world. And even my idea of magic was magic is simply the placing of meaning into the world. And we can place different meanings. Therefore, we can kind of be magicians. Who is the great magician who makes the grass green? I am, because I'm making the grass green, which is great. That's an interesting thing. It's a wonderful playground. But I had this sort of realization when I looked at the hemispheric differences and the Owen Barfield work, and this idea of participatory consciousness, which I think is a Barfield term. It's not, it's one that Ian McGilchrist uses, but he could have done easily. I was sat actually in this chair, looking at that bookcase over there, maybe a year and a half, maybe a couple of years ago, I don't know. And I thought to myself, what if the world was full of meaning? What if instead of holding this view that there's no meaning in the world until I put it there, what if the world was full of meaning? What if I enter that reality? And I kind of like my phenomenology shifted. I entered this reality where the world itself was filled with meaning. And I can't describe it. It's beyond words, but it was a really radical shift in my phenomenology. It changed my state. It changed my perceptions. It changed everything. And the world came alive in a different way. Even though I was just sat in this chair and I'm looking at a bookcase, you'd think, well, all those books are just things. They're just material things. But it's like everything came alive. I'm not saying it started wriggling around or anything like that, but it just had a different quality to it. And suddenly the world seemed like a different place. Everything seemed alive and interconnected at that point. Now, for me, in terms of nonlinear creation, so one of the major things about nonlinear creation is about connections. It's about allowing connections to come alive. It's allowing connections to almost have a life of their own. So in approaching life in a nonlinear generative way, I ought to talk about the term generative in a moment, but I won't. So approaching life in a generative way, you've got to go with the connections. You've got to let them have life. You can't step back from them and say, well, is that a valid connection or not? Because it's dead. It dies at that point. The process is killed. So like, you know, a lot of people are really into synchronicities and alignments and this sort of thing, and they'll go, nothing happens. I remember a guy saying to me years ago, he was one of my Tai Chi students, like back in the probably early 2000s. And he was really into kind of mystical stuff. And I was a little bit more dry in my thinking. Having done completed a degree in philosophy in the Western analytic tradition, which just kills everything.
Right.
He said, oh, nothing happens without a reason, in a sort of like twinkly way. And I said to him, yeah, apart from those things that happen by chance. And that was my left hemisphere just killing his sense of wonder and possibility, you know, pulling out the sword of reason and slicing through what he said. But, you know, so I used to dismiss, because you're being scientific rationalist, well, those things are just coincidences. Coincidence doesn't mean anything. Just because that and that happened, and just because you can draw a pattern after the fact between those things doesn't mean that there was anything to it. And if I assume there's anything to it, then I'm very likely a credulous fool. But if you look at it in terms of creation, go, look, it doesn't matter whether there is or isn't. It doesn't matter. The nature of the thing doesn't matter. The engagement with the thing is what matters. So now I tend to assume meaning in all connection and resonances. And there's something alive there and something worth following. And that it's exactly what I used to do with music. But it's giving myself permission to do that in life. Yeah, so that's another 15-minute monologue. So I'll stop for a moment and
no, I think this is all real. There's a lot to unpack, because I think that this is a way to it sounds like your perception of how things work you had to kind of look at yourself and say, what do I really know here?
Mm,
Because I mean, yeah, if I have something I drop every time, I know that gravity works in this kind of context. But
mm,
aside from those kind of things, it's, we spend a lot of time kind of unintentionally fooling ourselves that we know what the heck's going on
mm,
and why it's going on. I mean, just like going, if I can go back to your comment to your former student about, well, yeah, things happen by chance. He says, well, everything happens for a reason. Neither of you can say for sure that either of you are right. It's
right.
one of those, Popper's falsification. You can't. So
Mm,
then when people get that, they kind of have this, oh, so what do I really know? It's like this epistemology of, well, I know this much when I thought I knew this much, but then
mm,
my knowing this much keeps me sometimes blocked to creating and doing other things. So
mm,
it's this ability, it sounds like, and correct me if I'm misinterpreting what you're saying, you have to be somewhat grounded in the things that you do know, but you also have to be, there's a lot of stuff I don't know, and to be able to kind of move back and forth to
yeah.
create.
Yeah. I think that sort of both ending is important. Um, I part of my background is the Chinese internal martial arts, the Taoist
Mhm.
rather than the Buddhist martial arts.
Right.
And so I was exposed to a lot of Taoist philosophy in my early 20s, but not directly. I still haven't read Tao Te Ching. People go, oh, and some things about Taoism. You must have read the Tao Te Ching. I'm like, no, I can't get into it. So a lot of my Taoist perceptions and understandings come from teachers and practices, not from texts or books. Now, there's an idea in Taoism. So Taoism is very much about, as David Bohm would put it, participating in the unfolding. And there's an idea about Taoism, in Taoism, about being alive to the time, what's happening in the time. Now, the time is right now, it's the moment, the time. And each moment is different. Each moment is utterly unique. And if we want to align with the Tao, so Taoism is all about going with the grain rather than against it. It is about working with the forces that are unfolding rather than trying to force them in this direction or control them. You create with them. You do participate. There is an active engagement, but it's not trying to force or anything out of alignment. But in order to really be open to the moment, this unique dynamic, you cannot be held too tightly to certainties, to ideas. Because if you try and force your ideas onto the moment, then you're not really attending to what's going on in the moment, because you're sort of forcing an idea. The primacy is on the idea, not on what's actually unfolding in the moment. But on the flip side of that, if you have no idea to inform you as to your engagement in the moment, no ideas to inform you, you're not going to create or participate with the unfolding. You're just going to get washed away by it. So there's a way of bringing, there's a way of, like, the things that you quote unquote know, the ideas that you have, if you have too much certainty around them, if you hold them too tightly, there's a tendency to force them on the moment. And it sort of crushes the life out of the moment. And, it's not the Taoist way. But then again, you still got to have the ideas. So there's something that Stephen Gilligan, it's a metaphor that he uses. And I've used it in a variety of different ways. I can't even remember the context that Stephen originally used it in, but he talks about Errol Flynn, the swashbuckler Errol Flynn, and somebody interviewing him saying, you're a master with a sword. What's the secret? He said, well, you have to hold a sword like you'd hold a baby bird, not so tight that you crush the life out of it, but not so loose that it flies away. And there's so much in life, I think, that is worth holding like a baby bird. So ideas that we have about how things are, I think, are worth holding like those baby birds. Just the, I think that not wanting to throw the left hemisphere out, not wanting to throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Right.
I mean, this is the message of McGilchrist's book, is the left hemisphere has value. The whole metaphor of the master and his emissary is that the right hemisphere is the master, and the left hemisphere is the excellent organizer and facilitator and all of this that really ought to be in the employ of the master, but has hubristically decided that it knows best, but doesn't have access to the wisdom that the master has.
Right.
So, not wanting to go, oh, there's no value in that kind of left hemisphere way of rendering up the world, of holding things tightly in ideas. But the left hemisphere doesn't dance. It can inform dance. But if it tries to dance, it's got two, I was going to say it's got two, left feet, but it's actually got two right feet. But, it's not really got that capability. So I think if we're going to create, we have to hold ideas that we might bring to moments that could inform us and be extremely useful. Right. But we have to hold them lightly so that we don't insist on them, insist them into the moment and it no longer fits. There's a good, you get this a lot in martial arts, particularly my take on martial arts, because I've got a Taoist take on it. In fact, I was just editing up a video for my other YouTube channel, my new Tai Chi channel that I'm running, and it's got a little piece of video that I found online from a Chinese language channel, but it's showing, I think the guy's called Wang Yang. I always forget Chinese names, forgive me, because they're not familiar to me. He is the head of combat for the Chen village in China.
Right. Yeah.
And there's a little bit of footage of this Caucasian guy. I don't know if he's European or American or Australian or something, but he's obviously gone over to the Chen village, and they start off doing a little bit of respectable push hands, and suddenly this Caucasian guy goes for the combat captain vigorously, and that gets neutralized, and then they go back in, and he goes from again, and that gets neutralized, and then suddenly you see the moment, the shift. The Chen village combat captain, he suddenly goes, and you can see he's now gone into business mode. And he dishes out what I can only describe as a beat down, like a real beat down. A lot of very strong throws. There's no mats, so it's quite a vigorous piece of work. Now, there's some people critiqued him in the comments saying this is not true Tai Chi, right? He's just using external mechanics. So for those who don't know the distinction between internal martial arts and external martial arts, it's a bit of a fake distinction to some degree, or there's a lot more nuance in it than people think. But I actually saw something very different in that. I saw the Caucasian guy trying to continually force his ideas about what should work on the situation and continually fail. Because what he was doing, he was working with his ideas first, not allowing himself to be informed by what was actually happening. So you have a template for a particular kind of throw and go, I'm going to go for that throw. And he'd go for it in a clumsy way.
Right. Yeah.
Whereas the Chen guy, the Chen Tai Chi guy, he was in flow the whole time. He didn't do anything that the moment didn't inform to him. Every throw was not executed because he decided, I'm going to execute this throw and then forced it on the moment. It's because that's what the moment told him. That's what the moment informed him needed to happen. So everything he did was fluid and seamless. The other guy was clunky. There's an interesting idea in sort of Chinese martial arts. There's three kinds of hands. Okay, so that means just, it's just a term for skill. There's stupid hands, there's smart hands, and there's mysterious hands. Now, stupid hands are when you ignore what's going on, but you just go with your idea and you try and force it on the moment. You insist. So in order to make it work, you end up then having to kind of use a lot of brute strength and because what you were doing didn't really fit. It was a bad fit for the moment, and you're now trying to shoehorn it in with brute strength. So this is called stupid hands. If someone's strong enough and they have enough physical capability, they can get away with stupid hands, as long as the opponent isn't too sophisticated. Now, the next point up is smart hands. Now, smart hands has a lot more information about how things work, has a lot more distinctions in it, and is able to still bring ideas to the moment. It's not just going, well, I'm not going to do anything right now, but there's more intelligence in it. There's more live interaction with what's happening in the moment. And so is therefore way, way more successful. Now, mysterious hands is just a refinement of smart hands. It's got to the point where there's so much intelligence, so much refinement, so much aliveness to the moment that to the other person, it seems mysterious. They have no idea what just happened to them. They just got slammed on their backside and they never saw it coming. They just, oh, I'm here. How did that happen? There was nothing that told them it was going to happen. They didn't even know it was happening until afterwards. And it seems like magic. But it's a very high level of refinement in how that person is engaging with the dynamics of the moment and how alive they are to the dynamics of the moment. And to me, that serves a fantastic metaphor as a way, that's certainly my aim, is to live life that way. And to be just in flow, but not lost, not swept away by life, but in flow, creating with the moment, whatever the moment hands to me and what comes up, which is obviously non-linear because you don't know what's going to happen ahead of time. In the example of the Chen village combat captain and the Caucasian guy, there was split opinions in the comments. Some people were saying that the Chen guy was a bad character for roughing up the Caucasian guy so much, and some people were saying the Caucasian guy got a lesson in manners, and different opinions. But yeah, one of them's in flow, one of them's creating with the moment. The other is trying to insist and push their ideas on the moment. And I think in there, that's the difference that makes the difference. So whether people are saying, oh, he's not doing real Tai Chi because it's not internal, in my view, he's doing one of the most fundamental, he's realizing one of the most fundamental principles of Tai Chi, that Taoist principle of fully being connected to the moment and creating with what comes up in that moment.
Right. Right. Well, here's the $1 million question. When clients come to you and they go, James, I want some of what you got, brother. I want to be able to be more non-linear in my thinking, more magical in my outlooks, more creative in general. I know it's person by person, I work with that, but as an overall first step for most people, I mean, what is your advice generally?
It's either a good question or a terrible question. I can't work out which one it is.
Well, it's probably a terrible question if I'm asking. So.
I'm not sure I'd go to a place of advice, certainly straight off the bat. I mean, if I'm working with clients in that context, the first place I'll go is usually, what would you love to create?
Right.
So I want to get people to connect with a creation mindset first and foremost, rather than a production mindset, rather than a linear planning mindset. So I'm looking to, I want to encourage a sort of intentionality, and I want to encourage that to be held, but held lightly. So I'm going to start asking things like, what would you like to create? And this is a big difference between, say, doing what I would call change work, and a lot of people might refer to more as therapy, and I think coaching. So I quit doing change work back early this year, around about probably February, March time. I don't know, something like that. And one of the reasons is it kept pulling me into a certain frame of operating. And I wanted to just have some time out of that. I'm not saying I'll never do it again, and I'm not saying I won't go back to it at some point. But if I'm working with a client in that context, and I'm doing the work that I was doing with military veterans, and they come in and they're having a terrible experience, and they're hyper alert, and they're all, you know, threat response systems firing off. Rightly or wrongly, it never felt appropriate to say, so what would you love to create? At that point,
Right,
you know? And I'm aware that that might have actually had brilliant results. Maybe I was all wrong. Maybe my ideas about what should and shouldn't be in that moment were actually stifling me. But,
yeah.
You know, this is partly, there's an old Chinese aphorism which says, in order to profit, you must invest in loss.
Yep.
So I wanted to let go a lot of my change work paradigms. And that's why I stopped doing that for a while, because it's only by being away from it that I can really let go. Otherwise, I keep getting triggered back into my default reality tunnels and things. So I wouldn't say to a client in that situation, what would you like to create? But a coaching client, because of the kind of coaching that I do, I will go there. Now, it's still a novel question to most people when I ask them, what would you love to create? But it's the beginning of an entrainment, in a sense, in a way of looking at the world as being a place filled with creative possibility.
Right.
And starting to experience oneself as a sort of creative force, a creative entity. So that's my first point. Now, like, you know, some people might go, well, what do you mean? What would I love to create? You know, in which case there's a conversation to start being had around that kind of thing. So yeah, that would probably be the first place that I would go to. I tend to work with what I call a creation frame a lot in coaching. And I'll work with it in two directions, so to speak, because there's what you would love to create, and there's what are you creating right now. So there's a sense in which people think a lot of what's occurring in their life is happening to them. And that is one frame. Another frame is, well, you're creating it. Now that's a harsh thing. If you know, again, going back to a therapy situation, if somebody's there and they're hyper alert and miserable and anxious and all of this kind of thing, and if I would say, so how are you creating that? That would probably not be. That's a step too far in one hit. However, and it would probably, I would imagine, be taken as a harsh thing, or as a complete lack of understanding for their circumstance and all of this, because in that kind of context, most people are operating from my circumstances are the major driving force in my life. I do what I do because of my circumstances. This is happening to me. That's a place that a lot of people that I'm working with when I'm working in change work are coming from. This is happening to me. Now, my belief about creation is all creation is co-creation. All creation is co-creation. So if I'm creating a piece of music, it's not like I'm imposing my will upon the universe and making it conform to what I want. I'm dancing with the universe. There's a co-creation, but there's a way of participating generatively that is key there. So if I'm coaching people, I encourage them into what I call that the radical creation. I invite people sometimes to play what I call the radical creation game, which is, let's accept that everything that occurs in your life is a co-creation between you and the universe. But we're going to play the game of you just owning your side of the creation. So we're going to play the radical creation game, which is, how did I create that? And it's a game, and I call it a game for a reason, because I don't want people to get into the realm of arguing about what is or isn't so, whether it really is the case that I really am creating this or not. So, you know, it's a challenging game. I play it myself a lot. If I encounter somebody who's a difficult character in life, to me, they seem a difficult character. I'm experiencing them as a difficult character. and they're doing things repeatedly. They have patterns of behavior that I don't like, for example. I could hang out on the realm of, well, that guy's an asshole, you know, whatever it would be.
Right.
And sometimes that's kind of cathartic. I'll admit it, you know. But that's one position I can take, and it will give me what it gives me, and it won't give me what it doesn't give me. But I can look and go, well, how am I creating this? How am I participating in the perpetuation of this behavior at the very least? Mm-hmm. How am I bringing this out in this person? What am I doing, for example? So that's the radical creation game of assuming that all I'm creating right now in my life, I am creating. How am I creating it? How am I participating in that? I just knocked over a huge, just before this call, this big mug of coffee. I hadn't even taken a sip from it, and I managed to kick it over because the dog was jumping off me and I was fumbling things. And a part of me wants to say, oh, for sake, you know, why now? Why does this have to happen right now? Which is going to put me in the victim position in relation to what's happening. It's going to change my phenomenology. It's going to have me constrict. It's going to move me to a less resourceful state, you know, what you could call a lower vibration state. I use this metaphor of high vibration, low vibration a lot. It's going to reduce my resourcefulness. It's just going to do me no favors across the board. So I can play the radical creation game, go, oh, well, how did I create that? How did I create that coffee going all over the place? So that's one level. If I add magic to it, I can do even more powerful things and go, so why did I create that? Mm. Yeah. Right? Why? For my benefit. If I created that for my benefit, how did I do it? Or I can play the other half of the creation game and go, why did the universe create that? Because all creation is co-creation. So I can play the game of owning my creative side. I can play the game of speculating the universe's creative side with the assumption that, because I choose the assumption, that the universe is creating something for me. Mm-hmm. So these are positions that I can take, and they're kind of magical positions, because as I shift those positions, I go into different phenomenologies, different sets of experiencing, and they give me more power as to how I can meet each moment and create with each moment. So if I get that and I start to get this in as a sort of a way of being and as a practice in my body, I have a lot more maneuverability in relation to each moment of life. So I have a lot more creative options with each moment of life. Now, if I start coupling this with starting to develop a sort of intentionality around what I want to create in my life, the things that I want to see, I use the term manifesting. We can talk a little about the law of attraction, because it's something I had nothing but contempt for and something I have a little bit more interest in these days. But, you know, having a kind of intentionality, what do I want to bring into my life? What are the kinds of things I want to realize in myself and in my life? And being able to hold those and at the same time consider my engagement with the world, because I'm not going to make those things happen. I'm not going to think them into being. But the holding them in a certain way, not too tight, not too loose, we were talking about again, that's part of the matrix of being in the world that is generative. So I use that term, you said nonlinear creation dynamics. That's my slightly more marketing-y term. I usually use the term nonlinear generative engagement, right? Because it's about how you engage with the world in a non-linear way, but that is generative, that has good things blossom from it, and often surprising things. And that's the thing about non-linearity. Productivity, even if you succeed in producing what you want, it's not going to surprise you. Mm-hmm. But generativity is different. Generativity produces all sorts of good stuff that you never saw coming. Wow, look at that. Look at that. That's cool. That's cool. Mm-hmm. And I find that a kind of nicer way to be living in constant surprise at all the cool things that are coming together and unfolding out of life.
Right.
Rather than going, yes, I finally realized that thing that I've been grinding towards for the last 6 months.
And we certainly all have lived, if we've been alive for any period of time, lived our lives thinking that that grind was the way to go.
Mm, mm.
Yeah, definitely. Well, James, this has been a profound chat, and if it's okay with you, maybe we could delve deeper in a future interview, if you're cool with
Yeah,
that.
yeah, I'm very happy to come back. You know, it's talking about sort of nonlinearity and connections, and you know, I have principles around this, which is I now treat all alignments and synchronizations. I just assume them to be meaningful, to be
Mm,
auspicious, to be
right.
a sign that a resonance is taking place, to be a thread to follow. And you sent me the message and said you want to come and talk about this.
Hmm.
And right now is a kind of fortuitous time because I've been engaged in this. I've had I've been developing these ways of being, not to make some kind of product or to do some kind of teaching or anything like that, just for myself, figuring out what I call nonlinear generative engagement. It's for me. It's about me figuring out a way of being in the world that creates the things that I want in a pleasant way and an enjoyable way,
Hmm.
in a non-sacrificial way.
Right. Right. Yeah.
But I've been at this for years, and there are so many threads that I have in disparate places in my mind that I haven't drawn together yet. I mean, I was thinking I would like to talk about the work of Nassim Nicholas Taleb and his book, The Black Swan, which has been very informative as well in my approach to participating in the unfolding. There are lots and lots of things. There's so much terrain here. And this is part of the reason I've been doing these downloads is because I have 1,000 intersecting ideas that are not yet fully organized in a left hemisphere way,
Yeah.
you know. So I would be very happy should people who watch this video like the video, I'd be very happy to come back and delve a little bit deeper and perhaps get into some more of the sort of pragmatics of it,
Right.
which is,
Right.
you know, how that there is people like that, how do you approach
Hmm.
life in this way. A lot of it is to do with the mindset you come from, but there are sort of do's and do nots to it as well, I think.
Hmm. Hmm. What's the best way for people who may not be familiar with your work or who are and want to get in touch with you to get a little bit of that coaching? What's the best way for them to find you?
Okay, things are in flux at the moment, so I have if people are interested in hypnosis and my approach to hypnosis, which actually kind of follows these things because my Taoist leanings have always informed my approach to hypnosis. If people are interested in my approach to hypnosis, they can find out more on hypnosiswithouttrance.com. I have a book as well people can get called Hypnosis Without Trance, if people are interested in checking that out. And I will, at some point in the not too distant future, have a new site up and running called JamesTripp.online. And that's where I'm going to be doing a lot more of my putting out programs on my self-development stuff, which I don't have a huge amount out there on. I also have a website where people can find out about coaching, which is JamesTripp.co.uk. And people are free to find me on Facebook and particularly on YouTube. My YouTube channel is currently called James Tripp Chaos Wave, but will be being renamed at some point as well. Yeah, those are the places people can find stuff. Or Flowboxer is my martial arts channel. If people,
I was
people
gonna
are into
ask you
that.
about that one. Yeah, Flowboxer on
Yeah,
YouTube. Yeah,
yeah.
definitely. Well, just as we wrap up, again, I really appreciate you taking the time out of your schedule to talk to me, and I want to let everybody know um, I'm, I have a thing about so many people in the personal development field who probably shouldn't be in the personal development field, but this guy is the real deal. He's a great guy, and most importantly, he's genuine and he's honest. So definitely, if you're feeling an inclination to seek him out, my recommendation. James, again, thanks so much for talking to me today, and I appreciate what you do and appreciate your friendship, brother. I really do.
Thank you, Paul. That's entirely mutual. So it's really good to be here.
Oh, thanks.